Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's session of the NPTEL course Postmodernism in Literature. In the first week's lectures, we started looking at the idea of postmodernism. We spoke about the different frameworks within which postmodernism exists and the multiple ways in which one could begin to access it as an idea and also as a critical framework. So in today's session, we begin to look at particular texts. We begin to undertake a close reading of texts which are helpful to frame and understand postmodernism as an idea, as a movement, and as a conceptual and theoretical framework. We also in the first week's lectures reiterate the idea that postmodernism in this course is being used as a conceptual and theoretical framework which could be used to analyze particular cultural trends, particular literary events, and also various intellectual and various intellectual and literary sites. So today's lecture is titled The Death of the Author and Its Postmodern Implications. Death of the Author, as some of you may know, is a very seminal text which is increasingly being used by post-structuralists and also by postmodernists to talk about the ideas related to text and author and also the practices of reading in the contemporary. So we try to undertake a close reading of this text by Roland Barthes by engaging with it within the postmodernist frameworks and also to see how this text enables us to question and to redefine various conventional aspects related to reading text author and also the practices of criticism. The end of modernism, as we have seen in the previous lectures, it signaled the death of many things that modernism stood for. So when we talk about the death of the author, it's not a singular thing that happened in the postmodern phase. The end of modernism and the beginning of postmodernism also signaled and marked the death of multiple frameworks, various objects and subjective positions as well. For example, if we take the case of painting, after the modernist period, we saw a gradual breaking down of form leading to a denial of subject, and then we also saw how brush, stroke and texture was altogether demolished from the practice of painting. We also saw significantly the emergence of pop art with Andy Warhol's digital art and digital painting. It also became a movement and a cultural dominant cultural iconic practice, and gradually towards the end of the modernist period and with the high period of postmodernism, we also saw that there's a complete annihilation of any painting technique. So this is a modernist this is the end of modernist journey in painting. And in various other forms of practices and trends, we could see similar kinds of deaths happening. In fact, we saw the death of art as an institution. The idea of a text has undergone a number of changes, and even the authorship, all of those are contested notions in the contemporary thanks to the shift from modernism to postmodernism. So in today's session, we begin to locate the idea of the author. If Roland Barthes talks about the death of the author, at the beginning it's also important for us to trace within which intellectual tradition discussions about the author had begun to emerge. This is not a new thing that Barthes entirely initiated, and this is not the discussions about the author. Even now, we need to reiterate that it's not yet over. For example, there is a book as recent as published in 2013 about the designer, titled The Designer as Author, Producer, Activist, Entrepreneur, Curator and Collaborator. This is a work by Stephen McCarthy. It has been much discussed in this field of graphic designing, also elevating the position of a graphic designer to that of the author. And in film theory, this has been discussed a little earlier in the previous decades itself. There is this auteur theory which film critics often talk about, where the film director is equated with the author of a film. And as Stanley Kubrick has famously stated, one man writes a novel, one man writes a symphony. It's essential that one man make a film. So these discussions about the author is not limited to the printed words on a page. It's not limited to books. It in fact could be extended to a number of texts, whether it's a graphic design or a movie or anything that we see around. So in that sense, the ideas about the author, the discussions, the discourses generated about the author is a very prolific and a thriving field in itself. So if we try to trace the intellectual tradition of this, even before Roland Barthes wrote The Death of the Author, we have an essay published by Wimsatt and Beardsley in 1946 titled The Intention Fallacy. So this work was a product of this school of criticism known as New Criticism. We may also begin to see certain echoes of New Criticism in some of the arguments that Barthes begins to make in his own essay. And in fact, Intentional Fallacy is a work which went down in the history of literary criticism as a seminal work, which drove a wedge between the author and the text. So there is a distinction that this work makes between the author and the text. So this is in stark contrast with the previous periods in literary history, where the author and the text function as inseparable objects. The text becomes a product of the author, and the author's biography, the author's intention, so to speak, in writing the text becomes very, very important in our understanding of the text itself. So we have the new critics, emerging in the 1940s and 1950s who argue that this entire notion is a fallacy. And they also begin to, the new critics particularly, they also begin to argue that the reader could never really know the author. So knowing the author also becomes a very contested notion. And furthering their arguments, Wimsatt and Beardsley, they begin to say that a poem does not really belong to the author. It is detached from the author right from the moment of its birth, and the poem actually belongs to the public. So to assume that, to assume that the author has got any control over the intent of the poem or any sort of a power to control how the poem is being received, it's a complete fallacy to even assume that such a power is being invested on the author. So the new critics began to argue for a way in which the text could be read in isolation with the author by focusing only on the practices of reading, only on the aspects of reading. So from this moment, we come to Roland Barthes' Death of the Author, which is published in 1967. 1967 is an important date in the history of literary criticism and also in the history of postmodernism. In fact, this is 1 year after the year that Brian McKell designates as the starting point of postmodernism. This was also the year when Derrida published his celebrated work of grammatology. Of grammatology, incidentally, also become a foundational text of deconstructive literary criticism. So Barthes' essay gets published at such a critical juncture in literary and cultural history, and he very controversially titles it The Death of the Author. And that's just not the end of the discussion. And after Barthes' essay in 1967, which announces the death of the author, we come to Foucault's work in 1968, where he asks this question: what is an author? He breaks down the idea of the author. He tries to problematize the author function and talks about how the author function has changed historically and what its position is in the contemporary, which is the 1960s. So these two texts also, as you will see in the later sessions, we will be reading these two texts in dialogue with each other, trying to see together what kind of sense they help us to make about text and the functions of the text and functions of the authors. So here we now begin to take a look at the essay, The Death of the Author. This was published by Roland Barthes in 1967, and first it appeared in an American journal titled Aspen. And Roland Barthes, incidentally, was a French literary critic and theorist, and most of his works are available to us in translation. And his work in terms of criticism, in terms of cultural theory, it's very interesting, and it's considered as particularly important because he is located at the intersection of structuralism and post-structuralism. And here, if we also survey some of Barthes's works, we will get to know that in his early phase, he was more structuralist in his approach. But towards the second half of his career, we find him being more influenced and also becoming more influential in post-structuralist practices. Death of the Author is one such essay which could be located as a seminal text within the sphere of post-structuralism. It's also considered as one of the essays which would help us to begin talking about not just postmodernism but also the various practices within post-structuralism. And this title, The Death of the Author, in fact is a pun on La Mort d'Arthur, which could be translated as Death of Arthur, referring to King Arthur. And Thomas Malory had popularized Arthurian legends by compiling the various legends, folk tales and stories about King Arthur, and this text was published in 1485. So this title, The Death of the Author, is a pun and an allusion to the 15th century text La Mort d'Arthur. So the primary argument in this essay, The Death of the Author, is against the method of reading and criticism that relies on aspects of author's identity. So throughout this essay, what he primarily tries to contest is the author's identity and also pronounces his or her death towards the end of the work. It is important to see how Barthes establishes a connection between the reader and the text. So he begins to see that the reader is directly connected with the text and the text has an identity. The text begins to reach its destination only through an engagement with the reader. And his work, his works in general, Barthes' works in general, could be considered as some of the earliest moves in rebelling against structuralist reading of text. So this is very important because though Barthes begins his intellectual journey as a structuralist, though most of his early works are predominantly structuralist, towards the end he is better known in history as a post-structuralist theorist or someone who rebelled against the structural methods and practices of reading and criticism. And Barthes also makes a distinction between readerly text and writerly text. And for him, the readerly text is sort of a text which does not demand anything much from the reader. It only requires a passive reader because the author has already sorted out everything for the reader. There's hardly any puzzle to solve. There's hardly any work for the author. There's hardly any work for the reader in a readerly text. But on the other hand, a writerly text demands an active role of the reader. And here we also see that the reader, when he engages with the text, he also participates in this meaning-making process. And the meaning, according to Barthes, is not embedded within the text. Text ceases to be an object which offers meaning, but the meaning is within the reader. So only when the text comes in communion, in connection with the reader, the text begins to send out meanings. The text begins to make meaning. So this is a derived meaning which comes out after a process as he identifies it. So reading becomes an active process only when the reader engages with the text and participates in the meaning making process. And in that sense, Barthes also argues that a text's unity lies not in its origin but in its destination, which is when it reaches the reader, and origin is with the author. So the text which gets produced originally by the author ceases to be important, and the connection between the text and the reader becomes all the more important in the meaning making process and also in accessing the text as a coherent, understandable feature. Here it's also important to make a distinction between work and text. If reading is a textual process, then certainly the texts are very different from works. So Barthes makes this distinction in a number of his works, and some of his important works are The Pleasure of the Text, published in 1973, and Image, Music and Text, a compilation of his essays in 1977. Trying to distinguish work from a text, Barth argues that work is a physical object that occupies shelf space and it carried in the hand. It does not become a text until it reaches the reader. But text is a process in language. So this is important to remember that this is also linked with some of the deconstructionist practices, and Derrida also had an immense influence in the way in which Barth's ideas were getting shaped. And for Barth, text is a series of linguistic processes that are decoded by the reader. So when Barth talks about a text, the author ceases to be important. The reader emerges as the single most important entity who is participating in this meaning-making process. And text also assumes the structure of a narrative negotiation between language of the text and the reader. So this is all of these aspects, all of these negotiations, all of these interactions happen between the text and the reader, and we do not see the author emerging as an important figure at any point of time. His task ends the moment he completes his work, and the work becomes a text only when it reaches the reader. And as he quotes in one of his works, the text is experienced only as an activity of production. So it becomes an experience in the hand of the reader, and the work gets transformed into a text only when the reader accesses it. Having said that, this transformation from work to text, we need to see how this happens as well. So a work becomes a text not just when the reader accesses it, but also when the reader refuses to engage with the authorial authority. So author in this sense becomes a symbol of authority and also a controller of meaning. So only when the reader refuses to acknowledge that the author is invested with this power to control meaning, or author is invested with this power to be the ultimate authority on what the text actually implies, or what the text actually means, only then the work actually gets transformed into a text. So the text is, in fact, according to Barth, a play between the text and the reader. And you need to pay attention to this word play, because he also uses it very deliberately, because play is something which is not confined to any sort of rigid understanding. So there is a lot of room to experiment, a lot of ways in which the reader can play with the text, the reader can interact with the text. So this basic understanding is very, very important to be able to understand and access the work, the death of the author. So when we talk about the absence of the authorial figure, when we talk about understanding the text in isolation with the author, and about completely refusing to take into consideration the author's intentions while he was composing a particular work, well, perhaps this almost sounds like a restatement of the new critical dogma of the literary work's independence, autonomy, as the new critics would put it. And this autonomy that the new critics celebrated from historical and biographical background, reading a text in isolation with in isolation with all the other factors that surround the text production, which also was articulated by Beardsley and Wimsatt in their 1946 essay Intention Fallacy. Whether Barth's work is a continuation of this new critical approach, or whether it echoes or restates many of the concerns that the new critics had in the beginning, is a question that we shall come back to deal with. But however, at this point, it would just suffice to know that Barth's work dismisses all humanistic notions, and in that sense, it is not quite a new critical in its approach. And in Barth's approach, according to Raymond Selden, a leading cultural theorist and critic, the readers are free to open and close the text signifying process without respect for the signified. So these are certain terms which are associated with a number of structuralist, post-structuralist and deconstructive reading methods. We shall be coming back to some of these terms in detail. So Barth's work gives autonomy to the reader, and it is more about a celebration of the reader's attempts to freely read and freely interpret without any limiting categories. So as and when we begin to discuss Barth's work, it is very important to locate the author, the figure of the author. Barth argues that the author is a very modern figure. And this is a significant point to be noted, because he himself states that in the primitive societies the author figure was absent. It was only a mediator who was available, or a speaker, and his performance was more valued. The public who gathered to listen to a story or a particular rendition or a narration, because oral literature was also prominent in the primitive societies. The performance of the mediator or the speaker was more important, and his genius was not really admired. So the function of the author, the role of the author, was of a different kind altogether. In this context, it's also useful to remember that if we look at the ways in which the idea of the author has evolved across literary historical periods, in the earlier periods, we come across a number of works who were authored by anonymous authors, because they considered it not very important to put down their name against their own works. It was not important to identify the work in connection with the author of the work. So we have, even if you take the case of the first available Anglo-Saxon text, Beowulf, the author is anonymous, and a number of attempts have been made in the later stages to see whether the author is a Christian writer or a pagan writer influenced by Christian elements. So the current way in which we access texts is entirely based on the identity of the author. So there was a period of time in history where the identity of the author, or even the presence of the author, was not very important. Narratives were then seen as repositories from which anyone could freely borrow and freely take. There was absolutely no idea of stories or particular art objects being copyrighted. And also significantly, until about the 15th and 16th centuries, the author was not held responsible or accountable for a particular work that he produced. The responsibility and the accountability entirely rested on the printer, because he was the one who published it. The owner of the printer, the owner of the publishing house, was more responsible for it. Given that printing was a very modern phenomenon which made its entry in the 15th century, it took a while to be able to understand that the printer was perhaps only a medium in disseminating the work. The primary responsibility rests entirely with the author. So we shall be taking a more detailed and closer look at the author function when we talk about Michel Foucault's work, What is an Author? So in Barthes' works, right at the beginning, he tries to locate the author as a modern figure. And this is very important for taking the argument forward, because Barthes also wants us to keep in mind that the author is a constructed figure, that it was not an idea which was always already there, that it is produced by our society at the end of the Middle Ages. So this historical understanding about the idea of the author, the emergence of the author, becomes very important in also locating the significance of the author vis-a-vis the reader, and also in context, in connection with the text. So when he talks about the author being a very modern phenomenon, that the birth of the author happens at a fairly modern stage in history, he also makes particular references here. He associates the birth of the he associates the emergence of author as a modern figure in connection with English empiricism, French rationalism, and the personal faith of Reformation. So it's also here we can also see that the author, as Barthes sees it, is a construct, is a product of the Western dominant philosophical ideas. It's a product of Western intellectual thought. It's also a product of whatever the modern society required, whatever the modern society was responding to. As the essay progresses, we would also see how he uses this historical location, how he uses this relatively modern emergence of the idea of the author to also talk about the text, reader, and the reading process equally as a historical phenomenon. And Barthes, in that sense, makes a connection between the emergence of the author as a modern figure and how it discovered the prestige of the individual. So there is a way in which the author gets situated historically. He is a product of a number of intellectual trends and thoughts. He is also someone who helps discover the prestige of the individual. So as we wind up today's session, it's important for us to keep in mind these starting points in order to be able to access the essay in the next session. I strongly encourage you to read the original version of Barth's essay, The Death of the Author. It's a fairly short piece, and the translations are widely available in the web for you to access. So a close reading of this particular text would be undertaken in the next session, where we shall be dissecting the various things that Barth puts forward in order to be able to argue and convince us about the death of the author. Thank you for listening. I look forward to seeing you in the next session.